riding actually took out the series on the basis of that double scoring in the last round at Sandown. But here we see the grid positions and some of the practice times for this Boss Office Supplies trophy race, in which first prize is $800, a very worthwhile purse indeed, and a good field lined up. There's Michael Cork, 34. He rides for Bankstown Kawasaki in Sydney on an 1100 Kawasaki. 63 is Suzuki North Entry of Richard Dunstan, a local rider. But further across the other side of the grid, we've got Jim Judd on Honda 1100, number 121. Ron Haslam on the English Formula One Honda H that we saw in the Swan round. There's Dennis Neal, the big man in the red, blue and white striped leathers, going out now to warm up. Dennis Neal there fires up and gets away. Number 9 getting underway is Greg Toast.
Crowd here today at Adelaide International Raceway, as have all the crowds been at the first 2 rounds of the Swan Insurance Series. A record crowd both at Oran Park and at Surfers Paradise last weekend.
And Graham Crosby coming out late, but joining the field for this Office Supplies, Boss Office Supplies trophy races. We look at Haslam, the man that lost his title in Formula One bike racing this year to Crosby.
And I think it's fair to say that the reason that the record crowds are turning up at the series is very much because of Graham Crosby, the man they all love in Australia. The man that they'd love to have seen racing, of course, was Greg Hansford. Greg, why aren't you out there?
Well, John, as I said before, all our bikes, spare engines, all the equipment's back in Japan being worked on. The factory are very, very keen next year, spending a lot of money to do the the 500cc Grand Prix World Championship in Europe.
It's fair to say, however, that a promoter's dream in Australia would be to see Graham Crosby versus Greg Hansford on their home tracks.
Interesting that when Graham Crosby got in touch with Japan after Surfers Paradise last weekend, after having cracked the 4 pistons in the bike, wrecked the crankshaft and the camshafts, it got very hot as Crosby wasn't sure what revs you could take it to. Took it to 10,000 revs. It reckons in retrospect that about 9.1 or 9.2 is an allowable maximum, and it was just that problem occurring that probably dropped him sufficient speed to let Greg Pretty pip him to the post in the second heat and to win that heat. But Crosby got in touch with Japan asking for parts, and they were brought personally by Mr. Moriwaki, who's arrived at the circuit yesterday and has brought parts with him for Crosby, as we see Haslam now, the man who came here for the Castrol 6-hour originally, and so liked the local racing and was so impressed by the standard of it that he expressed the interest to come back for the Swan Series.
It is interesting to point out that Mr. Moriwaki, who is one of the great tuners of Japan, tunes for Honda and Kawasaki, not for Suzuki. His father-in-law, Pops Yoshimura, tunes the Suzukis, but Moriwaki put up his hand and said, if anyone's going to Australia, I want it to be me, father-in-law. So out he came, carrying Suzuki parts.
Crosby lined up in the middle of the grid next to Dennis Neal. He's to the left of Dennis Neal. We see there 63 Dunstan. Further along past Michael Cork's yellow Kawasaki. There you see Dennis Neal 4, Crosby C, Haslam H. Watch for that centre section of the grid for an absolutely gunshot burst away from the starting line.
$800, quite a substantial purse for Graham Crosby to want to pick up today, but at what cost to him? When you consider that he's got the Swan Insurance Series at risk.
Ben Dix, the starter, going over to his start button. Riders looking at the red, get the green, and they're away. And Crosby gets a dreadful start, a lousy start, but Dennis Neal bursts away, as does Ron Haslam. And Neal fighting with him on the local superbike, ahead of the Formula One bike. And in fact, Dennis Neal is so impressed some of the English people out here, he's been invited to go to England next year to do several races over there. But Haslam finally gets by him with the greatest speed in the thing. There's Cork on 34, being overtaken by Jim Judd on 121, who came 4th in an earlier race today. But here's the race lead. Haslam Neal.
Neal so delighted today because he has a new clutch in this motorcycle, a dry clutch, which means that for the first time since he's been running this bike, oh, he almost hits Haslam there in his eagerness to get through. But Neil has a dry clutch in the bike today, and that means that for the first time since he's been running it, he can really power off the line without taking the risk of cooking the clutch. As Haslam now on the banking with a lead on Neil, who had to back off there as he almost ran over the back of the Formula 1 1000 Honda.
Up the straight with Crosby and pursuit in third place. Here's the first six bursting up the straight. As we look down the straight, you reduce the effect of these bikes building up to over 250 kilometres an hour. Incredible speed. Then coming back down a couple of gears, there's Crosby. An incredibly talented rider. Very carefree though. Although more serious these days. A lot of pressure on that man. There's been cutbacks in the Suzuki race team effort in Britain, but Crosby was retained where other riders were let go. And he will be running next year in England on this Formula 1 bike and doing all the World Championship 500cc Grand Prix races, which is the pinnacle of Grand Prix racing.
Haslam in the lead, Neil behind him. Neil closer as they came into the braking area there, really extending his brakes, but Haslam opening a bit of a gap as they got onto the tricky section that leads onto the bowl.
Dennis Neil doing a grand job there. This is a super bike in the middle, which means it's got a modified standard frame where the others have special built race frames. As you see Crosby getting up there with them, now into second place. Into third.
Crosby came alongside Neil down the chute, but couldn't get past him as they went into the braking area. Big Dennis Neil really extending the brakes of this Honda as he races the two Formula 1 1000 superbikes.
Yes, those two other bikes allowed much more modification to frame, to brakes, and not so much to engine because they're all allowed similar freedom in that department. But Dennis Neil really doing a great job for a bike that's only about 2 months old. It debuted at Winton a little while ago, and the big man has relished in the power and the handling of it and done a great job. And it's Haslam's sponsor, Mal Carter, that's invited Neil to go to the Isle of Man next year and perhaps do a meeting before and after it as Neil goes back to third, Crosby blasting past, but Neil just might outbrake him. And he does, holds him back.
And it's Neil in second place now, challenging Haslam hard. Neil is the man under brakes. He's doing a fantastic job on this standard framed machine against the Works Formula 1 machines. As Crosby goes underneath him through the S's, then backs off and Neil takes over second position again. They come onto the reverse camber corner, onto the speed bowl.
Greg Hansford riders will only ride that close nose to tail or side by side when they have complete faith in the other riders.
Yes, that's right. Well, I think what Graham's doing now really is sitting behind these two and hoping that Dennis can get past Ron, because I don't think there's any love lost between the two, because Graham took Ron's World Championship off him this year, and I think he's just sitting there at the moment being quite curious.
There goes Crosby that time and made no mistake about it, and Dennis Neil is not going to get him in the braking area, so Graham Crosby back in, or up into second position with Ron Haslam behind him. There's a lap on the leaders now. We'll see just how quickly these bikes are going.
Just seeing one of the bikes there nose-diving, Greg, when it was braking. Of course, Crosby's Suzuki Formula 1 bike has anti-dive built into the front suspension.
Right, well, it's just a new thing developed to keep the bike straight and level. We've got 99% or thereabout braking on the front wheel of these bikes. When you've got the brakes full on, the back wheel's just sort of skipping across the top of the ground, not doing any work at all. And what Graham's got on the bike will keep the bike very level, won't keep the nose down.
Had a bit of trouble with it yesterday. Had to put in thicker fork oil because it works from the fork oil and the compression. As you start to brake, there's a valve that opens, it pumps the forks up, keeps the front fork stiff and the front of the bike up, you'll see Dennis Neal's bike probably dipping up and down more than the two Formula One bikes, particularly the Suzuki.
Well, Greg Hansford holds the 500cc lap record here, or the 350cc lap record here, rather, at 58.6, which is faster than the 500cc lap record, 59. Those times were set on Grand Prix bikes. You just saw these production-based bikes did a 58.8 second lap, faster than the 500cc Grand Prix record. Haslam in the lead.
Still circulating constantly under the minute. And this, an 18-lap race.
Crosby going for the outside on Haslam. Oh, hold your breath. And Dennis Neal comes right up to join him. Bit of grandstanding there from Graham Crosby, Greg.
I think so.
What was he telling Ron Haslam?
Just look out, because he's probably going to pass him in a couple of laps and take off.
But Haslam, not a backward rider by any means. How does he compare to Crosby, do you feel?
Well, Ron is a fantastic rider on his home circuits in Europe when he's got 50, 60,000 people sitting in the grandstand cheering him on. He's out here a long way from home, doesn't know what's going on really, trying to have a bit of a holiday and race a few motorbikes at the same time, and that sort of thing doesn't seem to work really.
But Ron Haslam, even if a little detuned, is still leading this race and doing it very nicely, thank you very much, from Graham Crosby, the current World Formula One champion, and Dennis Neal doing a superb job on that Honda CB1100R in third position. Crosby now goes alongside Haslam down the chute. Tucked in nice and tight to him. Haslam still in the lead. Crosby up alongside under brakes. Back inside him for the corner.
Tantalising for Dennis Neal, not quite with the handling, not quite with the power to get by these bikes, but all the time with them so close to make him just wonder if perhaps miraculously he could find that little bit extra that would see him creep through to the lead. But he knows that he shouldn't be able to do it. It's an almost impossible task, and he very nearly did there. Will he run wide and Crosby go under him again? I think so. Yes, Crosby back to second. So Haslam still leading. Dennis Neal riding every way he knows. They continue to circulate identical lap times on the last lap, all of them, 59.3 seconds.
This time Crosby closer, goes for an inside run. Haslam slams the gate in front of him, feeling out the track with his right knee. Haslam wears fiberglass kneecaps on his leathers to save wearing out his leathers too much as he feels the track out, actually making contact with the circuit to let him know how far over he can crank this machine.
Greg Hansford, Haslam, one that doesn't mind his bike sliding around, tends to be a rather eye-catching rider in that sense, as he often has the back wheel a fair way out of line.
Yes, well, you'll find most of the riders on these sort of bikes do, because you've got a 140 horsepower engine there and you're coming out of any sort of a corner and you've got the throttle wide open, and unfortunately tyre manufacturers haven't been able to make a tyre that can withstand that sort of punishment.
Rocket Ron now out onto the straight, Crosby down the inside and goes through him. Haslam slips into the slipstream. He goes for an inside run and he does it. Crosby's playing with Haslam out there, but Dennis Neal isn't playing. He is going so hard as these two European riders play games in front of him.
And if one of them lapses for a second or a fraction of a second, if Dennis Neal can find a way through, he'll take the lead, no matter how temporarily, because he'd love to lead these two Formula One bikes.
It must be so frustrating for a man like Dennis Neal as they come up to lap another competitor. It must be so frustrating for a man like Dennis Neal with such undoubted ability to be on a bike that isn't quite up to it, Greg.
Well, Dennis would be saying to himself, boy, if I just had a bike like these two, I'd really show them what riding motorbikes is all about. He's got the ability, he's got everything else, but he hasn't got the machinery that these two are on in front of him.
New race leader, Crosby from Haslam. Dennis Neal nearly second, but Crosby into the lead to 58.9. a fastest time there as Crosby swooped through into the lead. Dennis Neal, as you can see, still in close contact. Haslam wanting to get down inside under brakes, but Crosby covering him and saying, no thank you. I like it up front with some clear track. And Dennis Neal there. And the question mark now is whether Dennis Neal can just find some little bit of speed and magic to get him past Haslam and to take second place. It'd be a real steal if he did it, but he'd love to do it, and he's thinking about it now.
Last weekend at Surfers Paradise, Dennis Neal and Michael Cole, the two-team Honda riders, although rivals for sure, turned on the most fantastic superbike race after the completion of the Swan Insurance Series as Dennis Neal comes up on the back of Haslam again, and Dennis Neal took the win last weekend. He's on top form at the moment. Crosby looks behind him. A security gap now. Back to second place. Ron Haslam with Dennis Neal behind him. Haslam uses the greatest slipstreaming of his bike and opens up a slight advantage. The engines in these two machines almost identical. Haslam has the 1150cc kit given to him by Alan Decker, who crashed in the first round of the Swan at Oran Park. So Haslam has upgraded from his 1000cc machine, and there goes Dennis Neal. Ron Haslam ran wide, and Dennis Neal went right through underneath him.
Well,
I think Haslam might have missed a
and that's probably why Mal Carter, Haslam's sponsor over in England, has invited Dennis Neal to come to Isle of Man next year. The mecca for 70 years of motorcycle race spectators and riders, although in recent years some of the top riders have criticised it on the basis of safety and have declined riding there, but still to many people it's one of the great goals in motorcycle racing, and Dennis Neal could be there next June with a race beforehand and a race later, because the man has great ability and has, on the superbike, beaten Haslam in a couple of previous races in the Swan Series or supporting events.
Haslam now comes up on the back of Dennis Neal. Neal still holds second position.
There's Haslam in third now. Rudely relegated from first a couple of laps ago. The man that put an enormous amount of effort into coming to terms with the Castrol 6R and fell early on in the race, wasn't daunted by that, came out later on a bent bike to redeem his reputation and rode his heart out and won the hearts of motorcycle race spectators around Australia on television and at the circuit with his dauntless riding, as he see Crosby there in the lead now and looking a bit comfortable, coming up to lap Michael Cork on 34, the Kawasaki 1100, and Haslam put in an enormous amount of daredevil sideways riding, although he was a long way down in the field.
The problem with a long race like this is the heat and what it does to the tyres. When the motorcycle tyres go off, unlike car racing tyres, they don't recover again. You can back off for a couple of laps in a car and then have the tyres come back into contention again, but here, when they go off, they stay off.
Well, in fact, Crosby had trouble with his engine, as we said earlier, at Surfers last weekend, and you'll notice he's only running the top part of the fairing on the Formula One Suzuki. The bottom half is removed to try and get better airflow over it. He's cut up ice cream buckets to try and direct some air or keep it in over the finning of the engine, because it's an air-cooled motor, and under race conditions on a hot day like this, it really is running at its hottest possible temperature. As we look at Dennis Neal on number 4, the man, one of the quickest men in Australian production and superbike racing at the moment.
Greg Hansford, please explain what happens when a tyre does go off. How does it handle on the track?
Terribly. It gets very, very slippery. You normally find that we're not talking about rear front tyres, only the rear tyres that this happens to, because of the immense horsepower that the engine's putting out. They will, what we call, ball up and get little balls of rubber on the surface of the tyre and make it very, very slippery. The rubber actually sometimes just goes like chewing gum and just has no adhesion at all.
Now that could be happening right now after as many laps as we've seen. Graham, I think, is in no trouble at all, because, as I said before, he's so smooth on the machinery. I saw Dennis sliding around a few corners there before. He might be in a bit of trouble. But in trouble or not, he's still holding second position from Ron Haslam, who's about 1.5 seconds behind and holding station.
Lapping bikes is the race leader, Crosby. See him there on C, coming up now to lap number 11, Mick Hone on the Yoshimura Suzuki 1000.
And bike 121, Jim Judd, the local hero. As Dennis Neal goes through, but gets his nose rudely cut off by Hone. Dodgy manoeuvres, lapping slower machines. But he's through.
And now it's Haslam's turn to find his way around them, perhaps to be balked and to lose some ground. And Dennis Neal there picking up a rough section of track, which when you're cranked over can make the bike pretty unstable. Haslam now dealing with Mick Hone. Hone in front, Haslam lapping. Judd behind on 121. And Crosby, the race leader. Up front, 18-lap race, 16 completed.
Blue flag will be out on the next round to indicate 1 lap to go.
And they are, in fact, lapping the 4th and 5th place riders at this stage. So that gives you some idea of the pace of these two Formula One bikes and the superlative local rider and bike, the 1100 Honda Superbike of Dennis Neal. That's the man we're talking about.
Beautiful flowing action of Dennis Neal through those S's. There's Haslam, there's Crosby rather, in the lead. Coming around to get the blue flag from starter Glenn Dix, telling that there's 1 lap remaining and $800 resting at the end of it. It's not much by European standards, but it certainly will pay for a nice party after the end of the Swan series.
On the straight goes Crosby, and I was talking to him earlier, and he's expressed surprising, genuine interest in trying to get a drive in next year's Hardy Ferodo. He'd love to have a ride in the Commodore, and we're going to see what we can do for Graham Crosby about getting him a go in a Commodore, and he's quite serious.
Well, in fact, Greg Hansford gave up a certain drive in Alan Moffat's Ford team only 2 years ago to go to Europe and chase the World Motorcycle Championship instead. Have you any regrets, Greg?
No, I won the Yugoslavian Grand Prix the same day, so I think I came out on top.
So Crosby, this great talent, the checkered flag, Glenn Dix ready to do his antics, and another checkered flag for a man, second Dennis Neal, third Ron Haslam, a man in Graham Crosby, 24 years old, who's got an enormous future in front of him in world motorcycle racing.
The only disappointment to the crowd gathered here today, and in fact the crowds at the last 2 circuits, is that Graham Crosby has given up his victory wheel stand. He just refuses to do it anymore, claiming that it's too hard on the machine. At least at the end of the Swan Insurance Series at Sandown, I want to see Crosby hold that bike up for the full length of the straight. There he goes. Good on you.
Enormous flair, great enthusiasm for racing, and incredible bike control, seemingly particularly on the 4-strokes. He seems to be able to do almost anything. Not quite at the same terms with the 500cc Grand Prix 2-stroke bikes, but on a 4-stroke, the bikes on which he made his name, Graham Crosby is without question the equal of any in the world, and perhaps the world's best at this stage.
And Dennis Neal acknowledging the plaudits of the crowd there. There we go. Thank you, Graham Crosby. That's nice to see at last. It's the Crosby of old.
They tricked him at Oran Park. He'd always been trying to get to the end of the Armco at Oran Park, and he had a crack at it in practices down there, but he didn't realise they'd extended the Armco, and he was a bit puzzled as to why he was having trouble. Race time, 17 minutes, 51.5 seconds for that 18-lap race for Graham Crosby.